Bismillah walhamdulillah wa salatu wa salam ala rasulillah. I wanted to focus on this issue of ilm al-kalam because there's so much misunderstanding with regard to it. We have to be very clear that in the earliest of generations, when it came to the issue of aqidah, people went directly to the Quran, and their understanding of the Quran shaped their understanding of themselves and the universe. Because when we talk about the issue of knowledge overall, the Quran itself tells us that the first thing to be revealed was this command to read. And in that command to read, there was a reflection on the development of the human being. There was an understanding that the world itself, the creation itself, had an origin. So the first generation, they lived in an environment in which the manifestation of nature itself was understood in light of revelation. So when they were in the desert and they saw those stars and they saw the moon and they saw the sun and they felt the heat, they understood that there was a creator behind it. When they looked at life itself, they understood that that life was sustained by a creator, by a Rabb. And so even in the earliest of generations, with accurate technicality, we can say that the issue of Aqidah was an understanding of self, understanding of the universe in light of revelation. In light of revelation. And that's not debatable. Because when we look at the issue of how it is that the Quran is commanding the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam to reflect upon the origin of the human being, you have the issue of revelation and creation coming together in the issue of Aqidah itself. So in the earliest generation, there was not a necessity for explicating detailed issues of Aqidah from the angle of rational proofs. The What they leaned on was the Quran itself. Kalam existed according to Imam Ibn Khaldun prior to the Mu'tazila. In the Muqaddimah of Imam Ibn Khaldun, Imam Ibn Khaldun traces the history, and we're going to actually talk about this sometime soon. Myself and Sheikh Hamza Dajjal, we're going to talk about the issue of history itself and talk about the Muqaddimah, and this is one of the things that comes into play. But if you want to understand and if you want to see, go to the Muqaddimah of Imam Ibn Khaldun in the section in which he's dealing with knowledge, and you will see the history of Kalam, how it is that it is documented. The ulama themselves, after the rise of the Mu'tazila, and the Mu'tazila have to also be understood in their proper place. They began to engage the people of the book earlier on. So in order to engage the people of the book, they realized that it was not sufficient for them to be able to what? To be able to speak to them on just terms of the Quran and Sunnah alone. And so they began to learn their ways. And then the movement of translation came in, and certain philosophical texts, not all of them were translated, and that created a shift, what we can call the Hellenization of Muslim thought. The same issue happened with the Jewish community, Hellenization, except that the Muslims, because the Muslims had the Arabic language and they had the Quran and they had the Sunnah, they engaged in a different way. They didn't lose the language, the original language of the Quran and the Sunnah. So there was always that interaction between the sources of revelation and the sources of reflection, and the issues of the different sciences that emerged, and amongst them was the science of Kalam. The ulama, they had differed earlier on the issue of how to approach the Kalam. But not all Kalam began to be rejected. And so you had different schools of thought. The school of the people of Hadith, they were still a segment that was strong in force earlier on. But with the shifting of Imam al-Ashari Abu al-Hasan from the Mu'tazila school, he went in between the people of Hadith and he went in between those who were beginning to deal with Kalam. And like we said, Kalam existed before the Mu'tazila. That's not Yusuf Rios' position. That's the position of Imam Ibn Khaldun. And so with time, the ulama, they debated about the function and the role of ilm al-kalam. And so a portion of ilm al-kalam remained prohibited. That which was mixed with heavy philosophy and began to shift the thinking of the Muslims. Overall, even the people of Ahl al-Kalam had rejected them. The people of Hadith themselves stayed in a discussion on how that would be operational. How would they deal with ilm al-kalam? And so Imam al-Shafi'i rahmatullahi alayhi, in the Risala itself, he deals with ilm al-kalam. But Imam al-Shafi'i, what does he do? He refutes the foundation or the principles of the Mu'tazila without ever mentioning them. So he clarifies the way of understanding Quran and Sunnah in principle without even having to directly address the Mu'tazila. Imam Abu Hanifa rahmatullahi alayhi is attributed to him that he had delved in the whole issue of speculative aqidah. And then he left it for fiqh. And so Shafi'i and Nu'man, rahmatullahi alayhima, Abu Hanifa, they both left the whole venture of aqidah and they stayed with the venture of fiqh and usul and other things like that. And they advanced that. That debate about how to deal with aqidah has been there for quite some time. Quite some time. And so at the end of the day, the ulama, they split on the issue. So when we go to the time of Imam Ahmad, why is it that it's attributed, just like it's attributed to Imam Abu Hanifa, a book in Aqidah, but it's not always necessarily the case that, there's, in other words, sometimes there's debate on the isnad of the book to the author itself. But even if we say metaphorically or we say bitabarruk or whatever we want to say from that angle, that these books are attributed to the Imams, then we say that. So Imam Ahmed, why is it that Usul al-Sunnah is not dealing with a lot of issues? It's a very small pamphlet, and maybe you can put it on a loose leaf paper or two when it's done. Why didn't he go into an extensive dialogue on Aqidah? Because at that time they were still dependent heavily on the book and the Sunnah, and he just extended away from the book and the Sunnah to talk about a few issues that had came up that were problematic in the thinking of the Muslim community. That type of situation began to continue. There was masail, there was issues that have emerged in the discussions of Aqidah from way back, but the discussions of Aqidah are talking about issues, right, outside of the Quran and the Sunnah by reference to them. So Aqidah itself begins to be a discussion on issues of belief, and it's not just an acceptance of what's just in the Quran and the Sunnah at face value. It's an elaboration, it's a discussion. When you keep going in history, you're going to see the ulama take different positions on the whole issue. They take different positions on the issue of logic. They take different positions on the issue of astronomy. Imam Ibn Rushd had put astronomy into Bidayat al-Mujtahid, and others had mentioned that astronomy was something that was considered to be haram because it was mixed with astrology, not because of the mathematical part of it. Because after all, the Quran teaches us that the sun, the moon, and the stars are there for calculation, are there for consideration, are there for reflection. And so then at the end of the day, what we see historically is that there is always this discussion amongst the scholars with regard to the role of ilm al-kalam and how it is that to stay on the original sources and so on and so forth. So some of you, you don't read the history of Aqidah completely. You don't know because you only go with one school of thought. That's one thing, and you don't read history of Aqidah, which is different than reading Aqidah books. And so you don't see the evolution of things. You're not greater than Imam ibn Khaldun. Imam ibn Khaldun, he's one of the ones that chronicles this history along with others. Along with others. Even Imam Abu al-Hasan al-Ash'ari has Maqalat al-Islamiyin, in which he's tracing back the different groups. And then we have the book on al-Firaq by al-Baghdadi. And so even in that, right, we start to see a chronicling of the history of the different groups. And so the terminology begins to shift and change. There's issues like Usul al-Din, issue like Iman, issue like Sunnah, issue like Aqidah. There's different terms to discuss different things that pertain to the issue of belief. And so by the time you get to Imam Ibn Taymiyyah, Ibn Taymiyyah is the muhaddith that takes on the way of the Asharis. He takes the principles of usul al-fiqh and the principles of hadith, he brings them together and he extends the Ashari school of thought as a muhaddith. As a muhaddith. But there's no doubt that Imam Ibn Taymiyyah is dealing with the Aqidah and Majmu' al-Fatawa and other books without a doubt. And matter of fact, he even talks about Tasawwuf. In Saudi, they had eliminated that volume from the Majmu' al-Fatawa at one point in time, where Imam Ibn Taymiyyah was talking about Sufism and this and that. That's not the opinion of Yusuf Rios, that's scholarship. Yani Muhammad Salim, Dr. Muhammad Salim, who was one of the greatest scholars to be this to do research in Ibn Taymiyyah, talked about these points. And anyone who is a student in real sense knows who Muhammad Salim is as far as Ibn Taymiyyah is concerned. But so what happened in the Salafi Dawah, especially coming out of Saudi, is by eliminating things like usul al-fiqh, by eliminating things like mantiq, by eliminating things like a deeper study of the Arabic language. All of that stuff became inaccessible to the students of knowledge. And that's why the higher level theoretical, philosophical, usuli books of Ibn Taymiyyah, they're not studied much except by a few people. And there's a few that have reached that level in Saudi when it comes to the issue of the study of the books of Ibn Taymiyyah. So people are stuck on a certain conception of the history of Aqidah, which that has nothing to do with what I believe and you believe. We're talking about the history of Aqidah. We have to be objective when we start talking about knowledge. We can't make stuff up. The ulama, not all of them agreed on the principle of Kalaam. So when we start talking about the Salafi Dawah and what it tried to revive, it tried to go back to the past to revive the Aqidah studies as maybe they were attempting to be put forward early on. But how can you do that when you have a whole history and a whole series of trajectories and traditions? And so when you bring up the issue of ilm al-kalam being haram, this is يعني هذا حكم متقرر متداول بين العلماء. Nobody's arguing about that issue. That some of the scholars, it was clear, it was widespread amongst them that ilm al-kalam was prohibited. Ibn Salah himself had argued against that. But at the same time, some of them, if you understand their histories and you understand their positions, some of them never studied ilm al-kalam or they never studied mantiq. So the other scholars say, how can you even talk about something being haram when you never even studied it to even understand it? That is the actual history of what was happening in Islamic scholarship. That's why Imam Shawkani brings up that very principle. Imam Shawkani, the muhaddith from people of Ahl al-Athar, the mujtahid, the mujaddid. You understand what I'm saying? We're not playing with low-level scholarship here. But Imam Shawkani even brings up that point. So there's no way to say that Imam Ibn Taymiyyah did not engage in ilm al-kalam. That is a Salafi misnomer. He did engage in ilm al-kalam, and he gave it his own shape. He refuted logic. He established the foundations on his kalam on another foundation, which was not the foundation, in the same exact methodology that the scholars of ilm al-kalam that were dealing with logic and philosophy and all that they the path that, or the trajectory that they treaded. Imam Ibn Taymiyyah, that's why the Ashari sometimes don't understand Ibn Taymiyyah. Because Imam Ibn Taymiyyah built a system at a certain point on an orientation where he tried to absolve himself, remove himself from the usage of logic in order to build terminology. And he said that the terminology should be rooted in the Quran and the Sunnah, so that we should take out terms from the Quran itself and begin to build our tasawwurat, our conceptualization, our understanding. But see, even in Saudiya with these types of terms, the tasawwur and all of this type of stuff, they clash with that. And what that did to the scholars of Saudi, the students of knowledge, is it took them away from being able to even access Ibn Taymiyyah or even some of the Hanabila. That's why Shaykh Uthaymeen, when he explained Mukhtasar al-Tahrir and Usul al-Fiqh, he wasn't dealing even with the parts of logic in it. That's completely different than what people like Shaykh Amin al-Shanqiti did when they were teaching at the time of Shaykh ibn Baz, when Shaykh Amin al-Shanqiti was teaching logic in the University of Medina. It gave the students access to be able to read the books of the ulama. The same thing with Sheikh Adam Ethiopi, the Muhaddith, Rahmatullahi alayh, when you listen to his lectures. You understand what I'm saying? We're not playing with low level knowledge here. If we got to flex, we'll flex. Don't bring me low level knowledge if you don't understand where scholarship is at the end of the day. There's no way you're going to tell me that Ibn Taymiyyah's understanding of logic is just a refutation of logic. Ibn Taymiyyah is talking about his positions on logic and whether it is a definition can identify something or not. That's philosophy. And when you go and you see his theory on fitrah, that's ilm al-kalam. And when you go and you see his theory on nubuwwah, it's ilm al-kalam. It's not just the issue of refutation. Imam Ibn Taymiyyah develops an understanding of how it is that he is going to approach the issue of nubuwwah and the issue of tawheed, the existence of Allah wa ta'ala, which was a preoccupation for the people of ilm al-kalam. And he says first we start off with proving nubuwwah itself, and if we can prove nubuwwah rationally, then we accept revelation and everything else comes after that, like belief in Allah wa ta'ala, and also there's support for that belief in creation itself, ourselves, and the world. That's not something that the Salaf were debating or arguing. They didn't even deal with things from that angle. Imam Ibn Taymiyyah is responding to the mutakallimin, and he has his own position. It's not just the issue of refutation. So those who say that kalam is just the issue of refutation, they don't understand, or aqeedah is just the issue of refuting kalam. They don't understand what they're talking about. Look at the ta'rif. تعريف علم الكلام. علم الكلام علم يقتضي معه على إثبات العقائد الدينية بإيراد الحجج والدفاع الشبهة. Right? And so this is the ilm which focuses itself on, it centers itself on the whole concept of proving the existence of, or proving Aqidah, establishing principles in Aqidah with rational proofs and defending. Imam Ibn Khaldun says هو علم يتضمن الحجج عن العقائد الإيمانية بالأدلة العقلية. He makes it more clear, which is something that I wanted to clarify. He says that it's a knowledge which includes within it rational proofs that deal with establishing Iman based on those proofs. And so when you look at, for instance, what Ibn Taymiyyah is doing, Ibn al-Qayyim and others, that's exactly what they're doing. But the difference is that what is very dominant in them is that they're from the people of Hadith. They're muhaddithun. There's some scholars of ilm al-kalam that are muhaddithun, but they don't allow the hadith based orientation to dominate, and so they go with the more philosophical approach. But in ilm al kalam, to be fair, whether it's Asharis or whether it's people like Imam al Wazir or whether it's people like Imam ibn Taymiyyah or others, all of them are not in approval of the ilm al kalam, which is just going to plunge us into confusion. That happened in ilm al kalam. That's why many of the ulama were against it, right? Because of the back and forth. But you know what? One of the problems that we have is with all of this arguing about Aqidah and this and that, is that the same thing that people were saying that Ilm al-Kalam was rejected for, they do it in worse, which is all the back and forth and the dispute and the refutation. That's not from the Minhaj of the Salaf. The constant refutation and the back and forth. And so Ilm al-Kalam, to say that it's just, it would, they just refute it. No. So what's the purpose? When you refute, then what's left? That's not what Muhammad Aman al-Jami said about the study of Aqidah books. He said it's the issue of defense and clarification. That's the purpose of the Aqidah books. And that is the definition of Ilm al-Kalam. Even though he himself, la yu'abbir, in that state where he made that statement, you know what I'm saying? He's not directly saying Ilm al-Kalam, but by definition is Ilm al-Kalam. Right? علم يقتضي معه إثبات العقائد الدينية بإيراد الحجج ودفاع الشبهة. That is the knowledge, right? In which what's considered in it is how to establish fundamentals of Aqidah based on rational proofs and to defend belief against doubt. And that's just the reality of the situation. That's how that works. So we can't, we have to understand the history. And we have to even, if we go, and also in a lot of this, we have to understand even what were some of the aims and the goals of the Salafi Da'wah in its various manifestations. Because Saudi itself does not own the Salafi Da'wah. That's a problem of those who have latched on to the Salafi Da'wah coming out of Saudi, that they think that that is the only way. Ahl al-Hadith in India, Sadiq Hassan Khan and Shawkani and all of them in Yemen. Jamal ad-Din al-Qasimi in Sham. There was a number of different people. Rashid Rida before that. He was a big influence on al-Albani. They had their orientation already. A good portion of the world, Shah Wali Allah Dahlawi, they were moving to try to study Hadith, to try to recapture the study of Hadith, and it came in different forms. And some people, they stayed with what it was that Sheikh Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab brought. But you can't play tyranny on 1400 years of history and say that it's only our way, and you knock every scholar out like you don't have, like there's no other understanding. That's the most ridiculous thing to say. The Library of Islam is not just the book and the Sunnah and the books of Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab. That's a mistake. If I were to bring you what it is that Sadiq Hassan Khan is saying in his books in Aqidah, he has Kalaam in it. That's to be fair, to be open. But he's from the people of Hadith. And like we said, Imam Shawkani, look at what he says in Adab Talib. He says after the Mujtahid, he's talking about the higher level scholar, not some low weight student of knowledge. He says he's after the Mujtahid, masters Usul al-Fiqh. Then he goes on to master Ilm al-Kalam, and he puts in the Asharis, and he puts in the Maturidis, and he puts in the Mu'tazila, and he says, and he looks at all of those opinions and he weighs the evidence to see who has the stronger evidence, which is the way of the Mujtahid. And so how can people talk about a thing that they don't know? If you haven't delved into Ilm al-Kalam and you're just relating what someone else said, then you shouldn't talk. You should just say, I don't know about that. La adri. Allahu alam. I don't know. I know that we don't study that, and that's it. But to try to emphasize this point and that point, but that's not talib ilm. That's not the approach of the people of ilm, the people of knowledge. It doesn't work like that. And so, for instance, to say that they just studied to refute. No, they didn't study to refute. They didn't just study to refute. Even Muhammad Aman al-Jami says that they study to clarify the terminology, and he tries to make it simple because he knows the environment how it is. But not everything is off and wrong. It is that it's impossible for everything to be off and wrong just because people don't agree with you, just because people are not following. That's the most ridiculous conception on the face of the earth, to think that just because people say something and it doesn't come from your teacher or it doesn't come from your circle or your group, that is often wrong. I thought that the approach was to be that we look at evidence, but because people are not at that level to be able to look at evidence, they slide back into judging people according to what group that they're in. They don't weigh words according to evidence. So at the end of the day, people know that doesn't work like that. The history of Aqidah, it's a long history. It has a lot of contours to it. It has a lot of different trajectories. You understand what I'm saying? And it involves a lot of different groups. Within that, one group is Ahl al-Hadith. But even the usage of Aqidah itself is not a Quranic term. You understand what I'm saying? The Quranic term, the term from the book and the Sunnah is Iman, is Deen, is Islam, is Ihsan. The term Aqidah is not in the Quran and the Sunnah as a concept or as a term in that way. You understand what I'm saying? That we have like those terms. That's not my statement. That's the statement of the ulama. And so the issue, if we're going to talk about Aqidah overall, then we have to know what we're talking about when we talk about the discipline of Aqidah. Because if you don't know what you're talking about with the discipline of Aqidah, and you don't know the different methodologies and so on and so forth of how people approach different things, then why are you talking about an academic subject? Stay focused on what's clear at your level. You understand what I'm saying? If you're going to enter into it and you're going to talk about the ilm al-kalam is haram or prohibited, this, that, give me all of the rulings. Give me all of the rulings that are there. You understand what I'm saying? I need a full discussion. I don't stop at just because you quote someone that says something is prohibited is like that. I've had the book like almost 20 years ago. With of Ibn Rajab's book of Fadl al-Ilm as-Salaf al-Khalaf. What does that mean at the end of the day? You understand what I'm saying? What does that mean? Ibn Taymiyyah was from the Khalaf. And he definitely wasn't writing, you know, without kalam, without logic, without philosophy, without any of those things. There's impossible to say that. For someone to claim that he did that is to show that you don't know what you're talking about. That's a nice way of talking, rather than just to call you a liar. You understand what I'm saying? It's a nice way of talking. You don't know what you're talking about in that sense, and you shouldn't engage in it. Look at Dr. Mustafa Hilmi's works on the Minhaj of Ibn Taymiyyah, one of the greatest Salafi scholars from the University of Dar al-Uloom in Egypt, and see what he said about this approach. See what he talked about the history of Aqidah and so on and so forth. The only scholars in the world are not a few scholars, handful of scholars in Saudi. You understand what I'm saying? So that's not how that works. If we're going to look at ilm al-kalam, whether it's haram, halal, and if we're students of knowledge, then we have to understand the trajectory of how the ulama dealt with it. And so at sometimes in certain periods it was more clear than in other periods, but they delved in it. They delved in it. And it was impossible for them to be able to refute if they didn't study it. That's a contradiction in itself. Well, they just refuted. Well, that means they had to study it. That means they had to know what to refute. That means they had to know what not to refute. Though if it's just an issue of refutation, then why just exit out? Why enter? If everything is messed up, if everything is not sustainable, if everything is just corrupt, if everything is just bad, just throw it out. Don't even get into it. But if they're going to refute, that means that not everything is going to be off, not everything is going to be wrong. And so that is a big mistake. And people in Aqidah, is impossible that you're going to be able to deal with every shubha by just saying every doubt by saying we're just going to return back to the Quran and the Sunnah. Because the Quran and the Sunnah is not a hujjah, it's not a marja, it's not a reference for every person, people. You understand what I'm saying? So if you don't have you're going to go tell the Christian, you're going to go tell the Jew, you're going to go tell the Ismaili, well, you know what? The Quran says this. What about if they don't agree with you? What does the Quran mean to them? How are you going to establish that point? You understand what I'm saying? If they'll say the same thing, well, we have the Bible. The Bible is they'll make the claim Bible more ancient than the Quran. That's not how that discussion takes place, especially, and that was the problem that the Mu'tazila ran into when they were dealing with the people of the book. How do you discuss outside of the basics of just referring to the Quran and the Sunnah certain key ideas? And the issue with the Mu'tazila was that they took it to an extreme. They took it to an extreme. So at the end of the day, people know in different time periods, the ulama had different approaches to ilm al-kalam. And definitely in the earlier generations, uh, there was more of a despising of it because of what was happening. And then they began to change when they began to master certain things, master logic. Ibn Qudama himself included in his book on usul, the introduction to logic, which Imam al-Ghazali was the one that introduced logic as a science into usul al-fiqh. By the time Ghazali comes in, Ghazali was one of the ones that argued in favor of ilm al-zahir. And there's a whole series of arguments that he weighs out. And he was known to have, they claimed that he laid a blow to the philosophers. And that gave Ahl al-Hadith some strength. But Ahl al-Hadith can't take, and you're using the arguments of the Asharis to argue against the Mu'tazili, and then you use the arguments of Ibn Taymiyyah to argue against the Asharis. You don't put in any work like that. You understand what I'm saying? That may be fine, but you're using their minds and their arguments and their principles and their research to prove your point so that you don't have to think. And that's the laziness that comes from some people. And I've even heard that from some scholars. That doesn't work like that because you want to say that it's haram what they're doing, but then you want to take the benefit from all of the effort as to what they put forward. You understand what I'm saying? Dalil for dalil, and we've been saying this all day. Evidence for evidence, and idea for idea, and hujjah bil hujjah. If you can't bring that to the table like that, and you're just directly insulting people, you understand what I'm saying? And you're calling people from Ahl al-Bidah this, that. What scholarship is that? Just say that if you're not from our group, we're not with you. That's it. But don't bring labels. You understand what I'm saying? When you don't know if it's right or wrong, and when it's especially if you don't have the proof to back up what you're saying. And the reality of the situation is that most brothers in the U.S. that have studied Aqidah are not grounded enough to be able to talk on these issues. They're not grounded enough on the history of Aqidah to be able to talk about these issues. They don't see the complexities. They haven't studied the books of Mu'allim al-Yamani, Imam Ibn Wazir, Sadiq Hassan al-Khan, the books of Ibn Taymiyyah. That's just on the Salafi front. Much less that they have the ability to talk about the Ashari school. What books in the Ashari school did most of people study? What books in the Maturidi did you study in the Maturidi school to be able to talk? What books in the Mu'tazila did you study to be able to talk? We shouldn't talk without knowledge. We should acknowledge that we're just relating what we heard, and we're not at that level to be able to weigh one position against the other or one evidence against the other. But don't believe me. Go to the history of Ilm al-Kalam. It exists. It's written by Imam Ibn Hazm. It's written by Abu al-Hasan al-Ashari. It's written by a number of different scholars. Sharastani. A number of scholars have written on it. And guess what? Some of that stuff is in English. You have to, go to Ibn Khaldun and see and look at the history and see what it is that has been said about this stuff and how this stuff has um, unfolded. How is it transmuted? How is it that it's changed? But you can't tell me that a lot of the reasons why Ilm al-Kalam was refuted is exactly why it is that in today's time, you know what I'm saying, we bring this up again. This back and forth stuff, arguing on the deen, and slipping up in what you're saying and calling people kafir and this and that and Ahlul Bidah. This is exactly why this was forbidden to people. But it's exactly with the people that claim that they're not doing ilm al-kalam or they're against ilm al-kalam. That's what they're doing. And then when it comes to the issue of talking about Allah or talking about God from the angle of rational proofs or or defending people's aqidah against doubt, none of that is done. And that's exactly what the Mutakallim Ashari Maturidi says, and it's exactly what I've heard from top high level scholars in the Salafi Da'wah say. So, who is here that is not making sense except the people that are showing that they don't know what they're talking about? That they don't know what they're talking about. So people, you have to be careful who you follow at the end of the day. These types of talks are not beneficial to the general community. But I want to tell you, and I want to clarify for you, many of these brothers that are talking about Aqidah, they do not know what they're talking about beyond a set books that they follow, and that's it. They don't have the ability to judge other Muslims. They don't have the ability to academically present ideas on any group with any sense of respect. Because when we academically present on a group, we have to present them as they are in due respect for them, not make stuff up, not refute them. You understand what I'm saying? Present them as they are, then you show where you differ. Not going in to claim that you have the truth and they're liars and they're this. That's not the approach. That creates confusion. But in our community, what we have accepted for Islam is all of this back and forth. And I'm here to tell you in 2022, you community need to stop that. And I've been mentioning that all day today. You all need to reject that because that is not the Islamic way. You need to reject these bankrupt approaches to talking about God. They're bankrupt. People are arguing about God without any real relationship to God. You understand what I'm saying? Saying they're defending God, and then at the end they end up battling out with everybody over God. That's not our way as Muslims. That is not our way as Muslims. As Muslims, we're supposed to clarify things. You understand what I'm saying? And that's why we say higher level discussions in Aqidah are not for the average Muslim. Focus on basic things like Qul huwallahu ahad, Allahu samad. You don't need to get into a lot of technicality. Focus on your relationship to Allah. Now, if you have that foundation set and you're ready to move to another level, then we can move to another level. But we have to move from one level of knowledge to the next with good character and good behavior. And we have to, in that process, be talking about our own self reform to ourselves. What is it that we're doing that we shouldn't be doing? What is it that we're doing that we're falling on that's sinful? And we have to renew ourselves in that process. But we can't keep continuing to try to exist in the religion of Islam and everything is a debate and everything is an argument and everything is a refutation and there's no soul to it and there's no spirit to it and there's no heart to it. That's an issue, people. So at the end of the day, like we said, you have to look at the history overall of ilm al-kalam to understand how it is that the ulama dealt with this phenomena of ideas. And they dealt with it in different ways. And they leaned on different approaches to be able to handle the question that they had to deal with ideas which contradicted their ideas. But to say that people like Ibn Taymiyyah and others didn't engage in ilm al-kalam and didn't have their own kalam, that's not an accurate statement by any means, right? And to say that everyone just went with ilm al-kalam like some brothers say in today's time, everybody's Ashari. No, that's not accurate either. That's not accurate. Some people reject it. But we also have to have the understanding that in today's time, you're not going to be able to discuss every issue of Aqidah solely by saying this referred to the Quran and the Sunnah. You have people that have philosophical arguments that pertain to Aqidah that are not directly mentioned in the Quran, and so you have to extract from the Quran and the Sunnah. When someone tells you that they can change their sexual identity and they can change their identity and be whoever they are, that for us is an Aqidah issue. But how do you address that? How do you explain to someone that it's explained to you on a biological level, on a psychological level, on a personal freedom level, why it is that they want to go that route? Do you think it's sufficient to just say, well, you're going to go to hell? You think it's sufficient to just say, I'll bring an ayah from the Quran and that's it? That's not going to work like that. You understand what I'm saying? That's not going to work like that at all. The same thing with someone who's struggling talking about the existence of God, or someone, who is saying, God doesn't exist at all. It's multiple gods. You think that, they're in a position where you quote for them an ayat of the Quran and that's it, and you haven't even worked with the ayats of the Quran in that way. You're too busy focused on usul al-thalatha or kitab al-tawheed and those more complicated issues in Aqidah, which have actually, taken over many of the youth in Saudi and other places. You, their thinking has to lead them to believe in the existence of Allah. That needs another type of thinking, another type of thought. It's sufficient for us to just focus on Quran and the Sunnah, but we can't expect that everybody's just going to shut down their minds and that's it. That's not. We were given our minds by Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala to use them to reflect. If our minds, and that's what Ibn Taymiyyah argues, if reason is used properly, it will coincide with revelation. Don't be scared of reason. If reason is used properly, it will coincide with revelation. When you think about things clearly, when I think about this bottle of water, if I take it to the hardcore essence, this bottle of water, the origin, oh, it's plastic, but plastic comes from oil. Where does oil come from? Well, oil is a mineral underneath the earth. Okay, well, how does that process work? Did it just happen by itself? The same thing with water. Well, water is a chemical substance. H2O, well, how is it generated? Do we just have, an unlimited supply, or does it goes back to the natural process? At the end of the day, proper reflection on anything is going to take us back to have to answer the reality of whether we believe in God or not. Whether we believe that the world is created or not. Proper reflection will take us back to that point. You understand what I'm saying? That we will have to answer that. You can leave it at the level of trying to be scientific and this and that, where it's, cause and effect and that's it, but it becomes absurd after a while. If nothing has any causes greater than itself, that's absurd. Even Stephen Hawking himself came to the point of saying, well, there's a power above power, but he didn't define that power above power that stands on its own is Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala. He got stuck on that issue. The same thing with Einstein. Through reasoning, they came to some sort of understanding that there's something there. It may not be the exact understanding of what we're saying in the Quran itself, but it comes close as far as reasoning. It's a better concept than saying God doesn't exist at all, or there's nothing spiritual at all. It's just material at all. It's just material. That's all. That's that. So we have to realize that Islamic knowledge is bigger than ourselves. And our educational level is above basics. We built civilizations. We've had these arguments and these debates for years, and we have new issues that we're confronting in today's time. But the Muslims need to apply themselves. We need to apply ourselves to actually know what we're talking about. We don't know what we're talking about. We're not studying properly even Islamic knowledge itself. So how we're not even studying the Quran itself with depth. How is it that we expect that we know? Our ancestors, look at this book here, look at this book here, and I'm going to close with this. I want to close with this because we have people in today's time that this was written in the 9th century. Dr. Malik Bedri Rahmatullahi alayhi, who died recently, he had translated part of this uh, into English. So he entitled it Sustenance of the Soul. The first part of the book, he didn't translate it. I did some talks on this. First part of the book was physical health, which everybody is raging over today's time. What kind of carb intake do you have? Do you have the keto diet? Do you have the raw diet? What do you do? Do you do exercise routine? All of that, they were talking about physical health in relation to mental health. This is exactly what Dr. Robin Berzin is saying here. that mental health and emotional burnout has to do with our physical health routine and our food intake and everything. She's an MD from the University of Pennsylvania. And our scholars were talking about that back then. And then, so, okay, look. So then now he goes outside of talking about the issue of physical health. He says, we start by saying that since man, the human being, is composed of a body and soul, he is bound to face from each part of them firmness and weakness, health or sickness, or other symptoms that afflict his health in a negative way. And then he says the symptoms that afflict the body and upset its well being are those such as fever, headaches, and various kinds of pain that affect the organs. The psychological symptoms that afflict the person are those such as anger, sorrow, fear, panic, and other similar manifestations. And he goes on to talk about anxiety. He goes on to talk about depression in the 9th century. And it came up in the 20th century that they started talking about cognitive therapy. That's what where the Muslims were at. The Muslims were about understanding the human being, understanding the universe. They were doing great, excellent things. They may have had mistakes, but we need to get it together and do great, excellent things in the world and get out of this darkness that we have where we're constantly attacking each other and go into a state of greatness, people. I'm not talking about that we're equivalent to Allah. I'm talking about be excellent in our lives. But use the time period that we have to develop ourselves on every front. That's important. Assalamu alaikum.